We are observing a model of human organization. A single node is consumed by a larger structure, and yet the surrounding system continues, moving forward in perfect, undisturbed synchronization. This illustrates a recurring problem in political economy. Highly extractive systems routinely consume the individuals dependent upon them, without triggering systemic collapse or mass panic. This lack of visible resistance is not an anomaly. It is a strictly structured law of human organization. A hidden architecture allows local harm to coexist with global stability. To decode this architecture, we rely on the Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM. BKM is a cognitive framework that maps how memory units, emotional intensities, and structural constraints interact dynamically within the mind. BKM posits that human cognition naturally encodes complex, multi-scale systemic relationships into compressed mental simulations. We often experience these dense computational models as structured dreams. To understand how global extraction survives in plain sight, we must analyze the brain's baseline simulation of deception, dependency, and compliance. The cognitive simulation begins with a micro-level tragedy. A vulnerable unit, displaced by a hidden disaster, and lacking self-protective capacity, is forced out of its environment. It actively seeks safety. In this image, we see the vulnerable entity finding refuge. It is accepted into the arms of a larger, maternal-like figure. This establishes a temporary state of emotional and structural balance. Then, the state abruptly changes. The protective entity turns predatory, biting into the vulnerable unit and consuming it. The promise of care yields to irreversible destruction. Immediately, the simulation shifts scale. We move from an isolated betrayal to a massive crowd. Thousands of figures move uniformly through an underground tunnel. The critical detail in this tunnel scene is the behavior of the crowd. Despite the underlying urgency of their rapid movement, there is an absolute lack of visible fear or panic. The mechanism linking the individual consumption to the mass compliance is the protective image mask. A protective image mask is a deceptive organizational state where a predatory structure successfully presents itself as a nurturing or stabilizing force. These two scenes, the consumed individual and the calm crowd, are not separate events. They demonstrate that micro-level destruction and macro-level obedience operate as two scales of the exact same unified mechanism. We can translate this cognitive simulation into formal systems theory by mapping the events into a topological network. We begin with a hidden reservoir of unresolved pressure. The vibration forces a single disconnected node outward into open space, exposing its vulnerability. The ejected node cannot survive in isolation. It inevitably seeks attachment to a larger stabilizing node for protection. This bond appears as financial credit to a consumer, institutional rescue to an organization, or political security to a displaced population. This brings us to phase inversion, a sudden shift where the boundary reverses and the larger node consumes the unit. We observe phase inversion continuously across modern structures. Paternalistic regimes use safety rhetoric to suppress dissent. Markets offer the opportunity of a loan, which quickly becomes inescapable debt entrapment. Institutional betrayal follows a strict rule. Systemic harm rarely begins as an overt attack. It is structurally designed to begin as an offer of stabilization. Once the phase inversion occurs, we must examine why the destruction of the local node fails to alert the rest of the network. The consumed unit recognizes the betrayal and emits a high-frequency distress signal, but the outward waves hit the boundary of the larger node and dissipate entirely. In human systems, these signals are labor strikes, protests, and whistleblowing. But the dependency bond acts as an insulator, blocking the feedback from reaching the wider system. This total containment leads to agency depletion. It is the rapid loss of a unit's capacity to resist or signal as its resources are drained by the enclosing structure. Agency depletion manifests materially as worker burnout, sovereign bankruptcy, and the psychological state of learned helplessness. The energy to fight back is simply exhausted. Extractive systems do not need to silence victims externally. The architecture of the dependency bond naturally dampens the distress signal from the inside out. Leaving the silenced local node behind, we must now zoom out to observe the entire macro environment system. This introduces the channelized continuum, a structured network of predefined pathways that dictate the direction and flow of collective motion. These channels exist as global supply chains, algorithmic media feeds, and rigid career tracks. The channel limits degrees of freedom. If a unit attempts to deviate, it hits the border and is forced back into alignment, forcing mass synchronized momentum. This explains why mass flow continues without resistance. Even as localized extraction occurs, the broader population maintains its parallel trajectory because the channel restricts alternatives. In high-flow systems, conscious awareness is replaced by normalization and adaptation. The participants do not experience themselves as fleeing danger. They experience themselves as simply complying with the available route. Collective action does not equal collective awareness. Populations march into extractive paradigms because the structural pathways offer no other efficient trajectory. To measure how this extraction fuels the broader flow, we expand the 2D network into a fully integrated, multi-scale global architecture. This diagram maps 4 layers: local individuals, institutions, national regimes, and global systems. The metric of systemic imbalance moving upward is the strain token, a unit representing accumulated stress, risk, or dependency. Strain tokens take specific forms: economic debt burdens, loss of political autonomy, and institutional trust deficits. Through compliance, labor, and debt repayment, local units are structurally forced to transfer these tokens upward. Higher-order systems absorb these upward-flowing tokens. They convert micro-level stress and extracted resources into the fuel necessary to maintain their own macro-level continuity. Macro-level stability is rarely an organic state. It is systematically subsidized by the continuous extraction and upward transfer of micro-level strain. This brings us to the final dynamic: how extraction is perceived across different scales. This chart measures token visibility, introducing the asymmetry of awareness. This systemic phenomenon occurs where structural damage is intensely felt locally but remains entirely undetected globally. At the local, individual level, the accumulation of strain tokens is experienced directly. The pain, stress, and crisis are highly visible to the node carrying the burden. As that strain moves up to the institutional and national levels, the raw pain is filtered. It is diluted and abstracted into sterile economic indicators and political metrics. By the time it reaches the global level, the localized destruction becomes entirely invisible. It is smoothed out by the sheer velocity and volume of the aggregated mass flows. The analytical mandate for identifying institutional betrayal is clear. We must recognize the protective image mask before the phase inversion occurs, while the system is still offering stabilization. Destructive systems thrive not by generating chaos, but through cold structural geometry. They localize individual pain while permanently synchronizing the motion of the mass.